Full reference number 646.
Well, it's been a while since we've done one of these. Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Old and Mostly Forgotten. In today's video, we'll be traveling back to what now feels like the distant past of 2012. A crowded year for games, no doubt. We got the trend-setting Far Cry 3, the excellent Spec Ops The Line, the Thief-inspired Dishonored, Max Payne 3, Mass Effect 3, Hotline Miami, The Walking Dead, just to name a few. In that same year, we also got a sci-fi shooter from the creators of a commercially successful franchise that's still pumping out sequels. The game has acquired a decent-sized cult following in the years since its release, and is considered, by many, to be an underappreciated gem. That's right, I'm talking about Halo 4, which is only an underappreciated gem if you don't know what that phrase means. Now take off your Master Chief helmet and hide your ODST figurines, because we're gonna be talking about Binary Domain, my dudes. Alright, Johnny, roll the intro. That's right, we don't have an intro anymore. Right, let's get into it. So Binary Domain is a third-person shooter developed by Ryuga Kotoku Studio, creators of the acclaimed Yakuza franchise. After releasing several Yakuza games under Sega's new entertainment R&D division, the studio adopted the name of Ryuga Kotoku, which is what the Yakuza series is called in Japan, in August of 2011. I'll be referring to them as RGG Studio from now on. Less than a year earlier, Binary Domain was announced by Sega on December 1st, 2010, with RGG Studio set to develop it. With this announcement, Toshihiro Nagoshi, founder of RGG Studio, shared his excitement with the project, and how he wanted to tell a relevant story that would appeal to both Japanese and Western players.
What I wanted to create this time was a dramatic and energetic sci-fi shooter. When you hear sci-fi, you may think of cold, clinical environments, but with Binary Domain, I wanted to combine this with a deep human drama. The keyword we have in mind for this project is life. I wanted to make something that will be accepted by both the Japanese and Western markets, and this fundamental theme is something everyone knows, but which the full extent of can be difficult to grasp.
Now I have to tell you, reading this quote gave me disturbing flashbacks to when Capcom was desperately trying to appeal to Western audiences with games like Resident Evil 6, that Bionic Commando game that nobody remembers, and the confusingly titled DMC Devil May Cry. You all remember New Dante, right?
Not in a million years.
Oh my god, how embarrassing. But after looking at several articles, interviews, and having actually played the game, I can confidently say that Binary Domain doesn't come across as a cynically made cash grab for Western audiences. It feels like a game from a veteran studio wanting to try something different. Well, and one of the articles I read literally said they were sick of making Yakuza games. No, really. In an interview with the Gamers Hub in August of 2011, Daisuke Sato, the game's director, had this to say about the team being burnt out with the Yakuza franchise.
We had become fed up with the Yakuza series, as we had felt that after 4 games, spanning both the PS2 and PS3, we had taken the series as far as it needed to go for now. We felt that moving into some new territory would be nice, and we all quite liked the idea of bringing a world of science fiction to life. We decided nearly straight away that we did not want to set the game 100 years in the future, and so we decided that a future that was not too far from our own would be best, as we can bring in current elements and imagine how things will have developed.
I like this. New ideas, different directions. Good, great, perfect. I mean, I know they went back to making Yakuza games immediately afterwards, but we'll talk about that later. Leading up to the game's release, a series of blog posts and interviews with the developers were featured on Destructoid's site. They go over the plot, gameplay, and some of Binary Domain's unique mechanics, like the destruction system for the enemy robots.
We needed to create animations for each situation, such as robots with their legs busted crawling on their hands, or those with their heads busted becoming unable to recognize friend from foe. We've repeated quite a lot of trial and error to get these movements in ideal shape.
Along with this, Toshihiro Nagoshi went into detail about the game's consequence system and voice controls.
I'd also like you to check out the consequence system, the voice input system that's one of the unique points of Binary Domain. With it, you can talk with your ally NPCs while fighting with them in real-time gun battles, which makes your trust and bond stronger as you go through the missions with them. This is a game with real characters that have emotional depth and change over the course of the narrative. This makes the gameplay emotional and exciting, all at the same time.
To prevent this video from being 8 hours long, I'm not going to include every single quote in here, but I do find it interesting how focused Nagoshi is on highlighting the game's narrative and characters. It's all a part of the marketing, sure, but it also appears to be something he's passionate about. That's all well and good, of course, but are the characters actually as deep as he makes them out to be? We'll get to that later. But what about that voice input system he mentioned? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I do have some opinion. Turn it off! I know the review hasn't started yet, but I want to make this clear before we begin. I did not play through Binary Domain with the voice controls enabled, because, to put it bluntly, they're awful. I played one level with them and had such a miserable experience that I shut them off and restarted the game. I tried using my Blue Yeti, my headset mic, and even my crappy webcam. Nothing changed. The game kept mishearing my commands. Don't believe me? Look at how much trouble this guy had with setting it up.
Get back. 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 Get the
Now imagine that for the entire game. But won't turning them off ruin the intended experience, I hear you ask? Not at all. I've played through this game twice, both times with the voice controls disabled, and it's fine. The voice commands are replaced by a little dialogue menu that you access with the tab button. There. Now you can play the game with some of your dignity still intact. I'm glad these types of forced, gimmicky voice controls have mostly faded away. Honestly, interest in these types of mechanics were already dying out around the game's release. I'll bet most of you didn't even know that the Xbox version of Mass Effect 3 had voice commands.
James, move. James, Carnage. Open. Stasis. It's about bringing the best experience we can to Mass Effect 3. We're super proud of it, and we hope you guys like it. We're super proud of it. We're super proud of it. We're super proud of it.
We're super proud of it.
One more thing before we get underway. Binary Domain has a notoriously lackluster PC port. The option and config menus are bare bones, and the default mouse sensitivity is borderline unusable. There's an excellent fix you can find on the Steam forums that improves the mouse controls, and allows you to change the sensitivity while you're playing. I'll leave a link to it in the description. Right, now let's go over the premise. After the end of World War II, the world was split into two, East and West. Nah, I'm just messing with you. Okay, alright, where were we? At the beginning of the 21st century, sea levels rose around the world, resulting in the deaths of millions. With most of the world submerged underwater, countries were faced with the daunting task of rebuilding above the waterline, using the remnants of major cities as foundations. As a result of the labor shortage caused by the floods, robots created by Bergen, an American robotics corporation, were mass-produced to help with the construction of new cities. In the wake of Bergen's rise to power, a lawsuit was filed by Amada, a Japanese robotics corporation, which claimed that Bergen had stolen their technology. Amada lost the case, and Bergen remained the dominating robotics corporation, resulting in the US becoming the global superpower. In 2040, a set of international laws called the New Geneva Convention were passed, which banned the creation of human-like robots, nicknamed Hollow Children. A global task force called the Rust Crew was created to enforce these laws. Look, I promise there's a robot shooting game in here somewhere. Skipping to the present day, 40 years later, a Hollow Child stumbles into Bergen's headquarters, causing media panic. As fears begin to spread about the possibility of Hollow Children living among normal people, a Rust Crew is sent out to Japan to apprehend Yoji Amada, founder of the Amada Corporation, who is suspected of creating the Hollow Child at Bergen's headquarters. Phew! Okay, on to the presentation. When I originally played Binary Domain, I thought that its visuals were a breath of fresh air in a market oversaturated with gray, colorless shooters. I mostly remember white hulls, neon lights, and plenty of brightly lit areas. This is a reminder that your brain is a finicky bastard that is secretly plotting your downfall. Revisiting it for this video, I forgot how gray most of it is, especially the first couple of chapters, where you're fighting through slums and sewers. It gets a bit less washed out as you delve further into it, but first impressions matter, my dudes. From a narrative standpoint, it makes sense. The game is established that the lower layers of Tokyo, where you start, are flooded and decaying, which does provide an effective contrast to the upper city areas later on. But at the end of the day, you're still spending 2 to 3 hours running through gray and brown environments. And if I wanted that, I could play literally any other shooter from that era.
Like any of us has a choice. Look around you, Yankee man. No future!
Let me be clear. Binary Domain is by no means a bad-looking game. And obviously, I'm not against grittier color palettes when used in the right context. A game like Gears of War, for example, greatly benefits from a more muted color scheme, which helps ground you in the game's bleak setting and atmosphere. Fear 2, another good example since that game takes place moments after an apocalyptic event. Ain't no one gonna be singing sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows there. In the case of Binary Domain, however, I think it would have benefited from a more vibrant color scheme, or at the very least, the first 2 chapters should have been shorter. Really, all I need is 1 chapter in the lower levels to understand what's going on. The divide between the rich and poor has grown since the floods. Okay, now the poor have been abandoned in the lower areas. Look at how rundown they've become. Got it, now take me to the upper levels before I keel over from inhaling all this rust. I'm sure most people won't have an issue with this. That's fair, and to be clear, it isn't a deal breaker. Obviously not. I just think a different color scheme would have made Binary Domain stick out a bit more, and also been more in line with the game's tone. But I digress.
Don't panic, folks. We're not here for you, and no one's going to get hurt.
Why does nobody ever believe me when I say that?
Colors or lack thereof aside, to repeat what I said earlier, the game itself looks decent. It's not Crisis or Colonial Marines, with the former being way ahead of its time and the latter looking like it was made in the Stone Age.
Seriously, this game came out in the same year as BioShock Infinite and The Last of Us.
There's a decent amount of detail in the environments themselves, most notably this casino right here, coincidentally one of the more colorful areas in the game. That same level of detail is present even in the chase scenes, as you race past various billboards and skyscrapers while mowing down anything that gets in your way. Nothing mind-blowing, but also nothing that will distract you from the main focus of the game. Shooting robots. Lots of robots. Robots of all shapes and sizes. Big robots, small robots, huge robots. I've said robots so many times that it doesn't even sound like a real word anymore. While the normal enemy robots aren't anything special from a visual standpoint, the game features a surprisingly detailed destruction system that will ensure you never get tired of shooting at them. We'll go into more detail on that in the gameplay section. The bosses, on the other hand, well, they're a thing to behold. One of them is a giant robot that is also a bike. Sure, why not? Another is this giant spider that's still able to move around even when you've blown off most of its legs. They're weird and over the top, and I love it. It's interesting to play a third-person shooter with boss fights that feel like they'd be right at home in games like DMC and Metal Gear Rising. Now let's move on to the... Did anyone else see those rats? No? Just me? You know, I'm starting to feel a bit sick. Maybe we should stop. Yes, sir, I'm doing just great. Okay, let's talk about the story. So the plot of Binary Domain follows the rest crew sent in to arrest Yoji Amada, codenamed Beetle Squad. Led by 2 former MI6 agents, Charlie and Rachel, Beetle Squad is rounded out by Faye, a Chinese lieutenant, Kane, a French robot created by Bergen, and 2 American sergeants named Bo and Dan, with Dan being the protagonist of the game.
Sergeant Dan Marshall, ex-Special Forces.
Sergeant Roy Boateng. Ditto.
So, I'm to babysit you two then, yeah?
Now, does Binary Domain's story live up to its marketing? Does it have real characters with emotional depth? Well, I wouldn't say they have the same depth as your squad mates from Mass Effect, but there is an endearing charm to the crew of Beetle Squad. And funnily enough, I did end up getting invested in the plot, as cheesy and over-the-top as it is.
Fire in the hole.
Oh shit!
It's a chaotic romp through the sewers, slums, labs, and wealthy areas of Tokyo, with a few story beats taken straight out of Blade Runner and Ghost in the Shell, namely the Hollow Children plotline. It's well paced for the most part, and surprisingly cutscene heavy. Seriously, some of the cutscenes in this game are over 8 minutes long. I know Kojima isn't impressed, but 8 minutes in a normal third-person shooter might as well be 8 hours. Well, it would be if the characters were dull as shit, which they aren't. Beetle Squad's smarmy ensemble matches the game's hammy tone, as they're all exaggerated caricatures of their respective countries. The American characters are rowdy and hot-headed, while the British characters are snobby and precise, etc.
Everybody alive? Holler if you're dead.
You know, it's funny, but my briefing said this was to be a covert operation. Come on.
What can I say? I like to make an entrance. So, you must be Charlie.
It's Commander Charles Gregory to you, thanks.
In a game with a more grounded tone, I demand more nuance, but here I'm at peace with it. Need I remind you that we're talking about the same game where a giant robot that looks like a bike chases after you?
Jumped up prick. Really had a laugh back there, didn't he?
Stiff upper lip, old boy. Pip pip.
See, I rate hammy stories like this based on how miserable I am while watching or playing them. With Binary Domain, I wasn't, and there were even a couple of moments that made me chuckle. But the game never overplays its levity, and it doesn't use it to undercut a serious moment, which, believe it or not, you need even in a game like this. There's this tense scene early on where you come across a group of Yakuza interrogating a hollow child. It's scared, doesn't realize it's a robot, and eventually grabs a gun and starts shooting into a crowd before killing itself.
Intervening like that was rash. The last thing we need is more attention from the cops and Yakuza.
Maybe. But it makes me wonder.
What?
How many more Hollow Children are walking among us?
And there you go. The stakes have been set, and now I'm taking the threat seriously. You know what would have ruined the moment? If Dan turned to Charlie afterwards and said something like, well, that just happened, as if he were in the Marvel film. Thank God this game actually has some restraint in that regard.
I'm not done with you, Commander.
Grow up, Marshall.
Now, I've used many words to describe Binary Domain so far. Hammy, cheesy, over the top, etc. But I haven't described it as deep, because it isn't, despite what Nagoshi says. One of the themes of the game, i.e., what it means to be human, is presented in too shallow a way to be compelling, and it isn't explored in any meaningful depth until the very end.
Now just wait a minute, she hasn't committed any crime.
She is a hybrid. Stand down, soldier.
If I hadn't told you, Faye would still be fighting at your side. What difference would it make?
If you have to ask Amada, you'll never understand.
I understand. You're going to murder 108 innocent people because you don't like their parents.
It ain't murder if they ain't human.
And while I did enjoy all the characters, I will repeat what I said earlier. There isn't a whole lot of depth to them. I'm also not sure what Nagoshi means by deep human drama. I hope he's not referring to the romance between Faye and Dan, which is corny and mainly exists for the sake of a plot twist later on. If that's considered a deep human drama, then The Evil Within is actually a game about the importance of mental health.
I don't know what you're talking about, mate.
My point is that I don't think Binary Domain's story lives up to its lofty marketing. But that's okay. Now, I would have liked to have seen Binary Domain successfully combine profound topics with batshit insanity. Unrelated, but Metal Gear Solid 3 is one of my favorite games. But I still enjoyed the wild ride I was taken on.
Oh, I get it. Save the girl, right?
She is much prettier than you, monsieur.
Oh, real smooth.
And that's my advice to you, viewer. Go into Binary Domain expecting a campy adventure with ludicrous moments and energetic characters. Do that, and I think you'll have a good time with it. Let's move on to the most important part, the gameplay.
Hey! Wait a minute! Let me go! Stop!
And you're sure that the subject is stable?
Yes, we had an incident with him earlier, but he's under control now.
Good. Don't let it happen again. You know the administrator won't be pleased.
Understood, sir. Also, I have just received a report that the rat... Sorry, I mean Specimen 483 has escaped his chamber.
Let's keep this between the two of us, all right?
Understood.
It's no secret that Binary Domain is a cover-based shooter, a genre that was extremely popular in the mid to late 2000s. I think everyone is familiar with the gameplay loop at this point. It hasn't changed much since the original Gears of War. Or Kill.Switch, for that matter. You sprint into an arena filled with chest-high walls, take cover, whittle away at enemies, and move on to the next arena. The genre was dominated by Western-developed games at the time. You had your rare exceptions, of course. Vanquish, which is a good game, comes to mind. But Vanquish is a cover-based shooter in the same way that Postal 2 is an immersive sim, i.e., it isn't. Honestly, I don't know what genre you'd classify Postal 2 as. But unlike Vanquish, with its clever spin on a familiar gameplay loop, Binary Domain fully commits to being a straightforward cover-based shooter. That's not an insult, by the way. For one, because I don't dislike cover-based shooters, and two, it's actually a good one at that. A solid cover-based shooter from a Japanese studio, who would have thunk. Now, one of the problems people have with cover-based shooters is how little variety there often is in the gameplay. Fortunately, that's not the case here. You have plenty of cover-based shooting sections, sure. That's your core gameplay loop, after all. But you also have several Uncharted-style set pieces and chaotic boss fights to spice things up. But that variety wouldn't matter if the core gameplay wasn't fun. And it is fun, mainly because of how excellent the visual feedback for the enemy robots is. Now I know what you're thinking. Robots? Excellent visual feedback? Next thing you're gonna tell me is that Cyberpunk 2077 was totally ready for release. No, I'm serious. About the visual feedback, to be clear, not the Cyberpunk thing. I can understand why it was a big part of the marketing, because yeah, it is something that shooters with robot enemies mess up. Well, except for Hard Reset, but that's an exception. But before we get into that, let's answer a burning question. Does Binary Domain have a good arsenal? Yeah, it's fine. That's the reason why I'm not making an entire section about it. The only unique weapon in the game is Dan's primary, which is an assault rifle equipped with an EMP device that disables enemies and even some bosses. You can upgrade it through the game's point system. You earn points by killing robots, with your points being doubled if you get multi-kills, one-shots, and melee kills. You can spend your points at shops that are scattered throughout the game. With these, you can purchase nanomachines for you and your squad, which are used to upgrade stats like health and armor. You can also upgrade Dan's primary and your squad mates' weapons. Here's some advice for you. Just focus on upgrading Dan and his primary. Seriously, do it. For one, because your squad mates aren't that useful even with upgrades, and two, because you can easily turn yourself into a one-man army by the halfway point. Dan's upgraded primary will have the fire rate of an SMG while still maintaining its high damage, and you'll be loaded up on so many nanomachines that cover becomes optional. Let me repeat, cover becomes optional.
Absolutely brilliant, son!
So the moral of the story is to invest your points in Dan. For all you stock market fiends out there, don't worry, he won't crash like Netflix. But going back to the rest of your arsenal, you have your standard assortment of pistols, assault rifles, shotguns, SMGs, and snipers. Nothing too wacky, which is a shame, since I think a game like this could use some weird, creative weapons. But whatever, they're punchy and feel good to use. And honestly, the visual feedback is so good that it makes up for the lack of creativity. There's an impressive amount of detail in how the robots fall apart. The outer shell slowly deteriorates as you riddle it with bullets, revealing the metal exoskeleton underneath. When you shoot the legs, the robot crumbles to the floor and proceeds to crawl around like the T-800 at the end of the first Terminator.
Danny boy, a freaking star, man!
See, this is how you make shooting robots fun. I feel like I'm actually doing some damage instead of pecking away at an invisible health bar until it falls over out of boredom. Hell, this game should have won like 20 Game of the Year awards for that alone. In all seriousness, hats off to the team. This is great.
Wonderful.
After taking out the legs, you can easily shoot them in the head, or run up for a melee takedown. I shot them to pieces most of the time, but I went for the melee when I could, mainly because I wanted to hear that meaty sound effect. You gotta take pleasure in the simple things, my dudes. Much like Dead Space, shooting the legs is one of the more useful tactics in the game, and surprisingly, it never gets old. But if you want to exercise that strategic mind of yours, you can also shoot off their heads, which makes them turn on their allies. Your newly acquired robot isn't the best at taking out enemies, but it's still an effective tactic, and a good way to draw fire away from you and your squad. Speaking of which, let's briefly go over the trust system. Throughout the game, you'll be accompanied by 2 or more squad mates, and at certain points, you'll have the option of choosing which ones to take with you.
So, who do you fancy for your team, Sergeant?
This is important to point out, because in order to get the best ending, you'll need to know which squad mates to take with you at certain checkpoints in order to build up trust. I wouldn't worry about getting it on your first playthrough, but you should know how the system works. To get the best ending, you need to max out the trust bar for all your squad mates. Now you might think that entails choosing the right dialogue options in conversations. You know, like in Mass Effect. I mean, yeah, okay, that's not wrong, but for the most part, it all comes down to how well you play the game. That's actually kinda neat. I think it's an interesting way to weave a narrative element into the gameplay without killing the pacing. It goes like this. If you're kicking ass, your squad mates will take notice, praise you, and you'll earn trust points.
Excellent work, as always, monsieur! Your skill is incomparable!
But if you're getting your shit kicked in, one of your squad mates might pull you to the side and chew you out afterwards.
Dan, fight like a soldier, or would you rather run home to mommy? Yeah? You'd better mean that, survivor.
It certainly motivates you to play better, and it's satisfying hearing your squad mates cheer you on while you're tearing through the never-ending hordes of robots.
Dan, you got some real skills, man. That's what we need. Keep it up. And you sure do have a high opinion of yourself.
Now, it's not a perfect system, of course, and there's plenty of room for improvement. For starters, there should have been more audio lines for your squad mates, since each of them has about 2 or 3 they repeat when you're doing well. Honestly, it makes them feel less like living beings and more like mobile complement machines. On top of that, acquiring trust points can be extremely finicky. Sometimes you'll kill 4 or more robots in quick succession and be met with deafening silence. Other times, you'll waste an entire mag on one robot and be met with a standing ovation. Maybe they're just being sarcastic. I would also have liked for the system to have had more of an impact on the rest of the story, not just the ending. I know there's that romance scene you can miss if your trust level with Faye is low, but that's about it as far as I can tell. Apparently your squad mates become more responsive to your commands when their trust is high, but I couldn't tell the difference, and I had most of them maxed out too. And with that, it's time to move on to the depressing part of the show. What happened to Binary Domain? coming in with a decent amount of enthusiasm behind it. Binary Domain was finally released on the Xbox 360 and PS3 in February of 2012, with the PC version releasing in April of that same year. The console versions were met with mostly positive reviews, with the 360 version receiving a 74, and the PS3 version receiving a 72. Praise was given to the gameplay and characters, and criticism, no surprise, was aimed at the game's horrible voice controls. The PC version received a slightly lower score of 68, with many critics taking issue with how lazy the port was. The game, overall, reviewed better with players, scoring a strong 8.1 for both the 360 and PS3, a 7.8 for PC, and it currently holds an 85% approval rating on Steam. It might not have won any awards, but it still appears on numerous underrated games lists. But as we know by now, good reviews don't necessarily translate to good sales. Binary Domain sold around 73,000 copies in Japan during its opening week, appearing at second on the sales charts. A less than stellar performance for a new IP from a veteran studio. In North America, it bombed. Maybe that's because it was released a couple of weeks before Mass Effect 3. After the financial failure of Binary Domain, RGG Studio went back to creating Yakuza games. But that doesn't mean they've forgotten about Binary Domain. Speaking with Gameblog in 2018, Daisuke Sato expressed an interest in developing a sequel, though he said it would be, in his words, up to Sega to decide whether or not they want to do it. And just last year, Sato once again stood up for Binary Domain, stating he would love to develop a remaster for current-gen consoles. It's highly unlikely, but hey, nobody thought we'd ever get a sequel to Space Marine, so who knows? I, for one, would love to see Binary Domain get another shot in the spotlight. Well, it's about time we wrap this up. While I have my gripes and nitpicks with Binary Domain, I do think it's a solid game, and honestly, I enjoyed revisiting it for this video. It gets a thumbs up from me, and it frequently goes on sale for $3, so there's no excuse not to try it. What else are you gonna do with that money, huh? Save it for the next overhyped AAA disaster? Invest in NFTs? Don't do that. While it does have its flaws, some more distracting than others, Binary Domain is still a rock-solid cover-based shooter that is well worth your time. The destruction system for the robots is impressive, and it enriches what is otherwise fairly standard gameplay. Combine that with some fun boss fights and exciting set pieces, and you've got yourself a well-rounded gameplay experience. Just make sure you disable the awful voice controls. The story may not live up to its marketing of being a deep human drama, but still a fun, over-the-top ride with hammy characters that will entertain you from start to finish. Pick it up when it goes on sale for $3. That is a steal.
Let the good times roll.
And he's out of there. Thanks for tuning in once again, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next episode. What? Hey man, it's me, and by me, I mean you from the future. Listen, you messed up. Like really messed up. That rat bastard that's been giving you games got loose. He's about to destroy Walrus Studios. All of it. Reduce it to ashes. I don't have much time, so hear me out. He's going to amass an army in your timeline soon, and he's getting help from people within Walrus Studios. What?